Hello, welcome to the Ameliasburgh Heritage Village. My name is Janice Hubbs and I've been the curator here for several years. I would love to show you around the grounds. We have a few special things to show you. The honey house was purposely built for our exhibit for beekeeping in 1978. Our little replica general store here is used to give examples for the school children that come, and adults alike, of the stores of yesteryear. The main store that was here in the Ameliasburgh Village in the 1800s was owned by the File family. So we have a lot of artifacts in there, but we basically like to tell the visitors here that the little general store in town was probably the hub of the community. It also housed a lot of the post office purposes, and it was a gathering place for most of the people in the community. They would come and get things that they needed that they couldn't provide for themselves. This is our little log cabin homestead. It was original to Ameliasburgh Township, not necessarily this site. The original site was located near Highway 33 on the Victoria Road. The last owner of this little log cabin was Vince O'Hara, and he graciously donated it to the Ameliasburgh Museum way back in 1969. The kids have a lot of fun trying to imagine how a family of 5 would have lived here. I usually ask the children, how many rooms do you have in your home? And then they say, like 12 or 15. This has 2 rooms, an upstairs and a downstairs. Quite simple living, but it was good and warm back in the wintertime. A lot of things that you see in the garden were more decorative for today, but back in the olden days, they had to provide their own food for medicine and for getting them through the long winters. This plant here, the bees love, and it's called hyssop. It has a very pungent black licorice flavor and smell, and if you had a tickly cough, making a tea with the hyssop would have been the perfect remedy. Our little log barn here was donated by the Michael family along North Lakeside. It originally housed sheep, but today we use it to exemplify how the pig slaughtering would have been done on the farm in late November after the first frost. Does anyone know the difference between a chicken and an egg? I have the answer. It's 21 days at 104 degrees, and that would have been the difference that the mother hen would have had to do to make her little eggs into little chicks. This is just a little garden plant that we have for different examples of things that people used to grow. This is called feverfew, and it's basically like a little aspirin. It does what it says, fewer fevers. This is mint, and after the early settlers settled here, they were more worried about shelter for the first winter, and food was probably secondary. So they had to do a lot of hunting and gathering, hence eating a lot of protein. And after eating a lot of protein, sometimes your digestion gets a little bit out of whack. So when they would have mint, they could chew on it if it was fresh, or they would hang it up in the cabin to dry and make lots of tea for it. Even today, we do the same example, because when you go into a restaurant, they have little candies that are usually mint flavored to help with your digestion after a large, heavy meal. The carpenter would have been someone you wanted to know also in the village back in the olden days. He was very handy with making things like tables and chairs, helping you build cupboards. The wainwright was the person who actually made the wagon wheels, and he would be working with the farrier and the blacksmith to make the metal rings to go around your wooden spoke wheels on your wagons. But back in the day, a carpenter was your friend. The smokehouse was an integral part of the farm life, because in the summertime you were busy feeding all of the animals that you had to prepare for the winter slaughter. And after the first heavy frost in November was usually when you slaughtered the pig. This meat smoking was used for fish, to preserve, for chickens, sausages, cheese, and anything like eggs as well. If you didn't have refrigeration or freezers, you had to keep your food fresh the best way you knew how, and smoking by slow smoke and air actually helped preserve your meat so you could have it year-round. The smokehouse is very small. It has a very tight-fitting door. With air holes along the bottom to allow airflow. It has a little roof with a small chimney just below the peak so that the smoke stayed inside the building to fill the whole thing with smoke to make the meat smoking process a little bit less tenuous. If the chimney was any higher, you would have had more flame going on and you would have defeated the purpose of smoking and preserving your meat. This limestone church was originally known as the Ameliasburgh Methodist Church, later the United Church in Ameliasburgh. It was the original building to start the Ameliasburgh Heritage Village. The original roof was slate, and it was later changed to a copper clad. With our tall spire that we have, we are the tallest steeple in Prince Edward County. Inside the church gallery, the exhibits are changing constantly. We love to talk about our old history, so come back and see us often. Welcome to the Goldie McCullough Steam Engine Room here at the Ameliasburgh Heritage Village. This building was built on purpose to house this relic of a machine that was originally built in 1910 by the Goldie McCullough Company that was operating out of Galt, Ontario. This is an 18-foot flywheel which was used to run an upright saw that went probably 3 stories tall. The power was used to cut into saw logs for building planks for houses. In the olden days, they would have had a lot of wood needed to use for the carpenters and various machines like that. It was next to the waterway so that they could have lots of access to the steam power to operate to fill this nice boiler that would take 4 hours of power to get it to have enough steam to go up through the great big black pipe all the way over to the other end where the piston is. The piston is 21 inches around. There's 4 whistles to use as pressure release. They were not just for decoration. So this was a very good job to have back in the day, and it was a lot of hard work, and there was also a lot of injuries. This is a machine that is very close to Owen Bosma's heart. He is one of the founding members of the Quinty Flywheels group, and he was instrumental in getting this going. We have a little remembrance on the back wall that we can show the timeline and how things were found. This was abandoned on the shore of Wellers Bay, and it tells the timeline about how the committee put this machine back together.
Hello, I'm Dave McFall. I'm the village blacksmith here at Ameliasburgh Heritage Village. We're going to start off here with our forge. This is the most important part of our shop here because it allows us to heat our metal to work it. Traditionally, we'd start a fire with wood and strike it up with flint and steel, but we don't really have time for that. So we're going to cheat. We're going to use a little bit of the community news here. So what we want to do is start a bed of fire in our forge. So we like to save some of the old coal from our last forging session. A lot of that coal will get converted to coke in the heating process. So we save that for our next session, and then that'll help us start our fire a little bit faster. We're using a hand blower here today. It will allow us to blow air straight up through the bottom of the forge. And that's where we get our heat from. So as we're forging, we have to constantly keep this air movement. If we stop blowing air into our fire will go dead, and we have to start all over again, which we don't want to do. It takes quite a bit of time. We like to keep a nice bed of fresh coal around our fire. As the fire grows and as we're working on it, that coal on the outside will start turning into coke, and we're just going to constantly keep feeding it in. Once we start seeing the yellow smoke here, this is telling us that our coal is starting to ignite. White smoke is our fire starter, and this yellow smoke is our coal catching. Here we don't use hard coal, we use a bituminous coal from Kentucky. Burns really clean, really fast. It's easy to manage the fire. We also have a bellows here, just behind. This is a hand bellows. It's quite a bit much more work. So this shop uses the hand blower. Makes it a little bit easier. Traditionally, I would hope that I had a son or two, and they would be my apprentices, and one of them would be manning this for me, tending the fire. So we punch a little hole in the top of it once it's up to temperature. And that's kind of creating a hot shell for me right now. That's going to help bring up everything that's in the fire up to temperature nice and even. I'm going to keep adding coal to the outside for later. And then we're going to start forging. We not only have to grow the fire, we have to control the fire with using water. We're going to wet the outside of the fire just to help keep it under control so it doesn't burn up as fast. We're really only working with about a 6 by 6 inch fire that's going to do all the work for us. One of the big things that we have to do, if you look at any blacksmith shop, the walls are covered with tools, parts. We would have our horseshoes, you know, an example of everything, so that if we had a customer, they could come in and pick the design they want. It's also a display of our art and our ability. A blacksmith, normally, if they need to make one thing, will make one thing. If you need to make it again or make multiples, you're going to start making tools to make that job easier. The next most important things in the shop are these two things right here, our hammer and our anvil. Without these, we can't work the steel. So one of the things that we would often make are tongs. We have several kinds of tongs, and we need a pair of tongs for everything. Most tongs are designed to hold a certain size of material. No tong will hold everything. So we need to be able to make our tools to work on the type of equipment that we're going to build. You know, we're going to make our own punches, we're going to make our own chisels. Usually one of the first things a blacksmith will make is a pair of tongs. Small set of tongs that would be used to hold flat stock and would be basically just a pair of pliers. A good blacksmith should be able to make a nail about every minute and a half. And that would be one of the first jobs that I would train my apprentice to do. I would have my young lad in here and he'd be making nails for us. The blacksmith would be responsible for making horseshoes and any of the metal components needed. Today, people specialize in shoeing horses, but at the time, you may only have one blacksmith and he would have to do everything. So there's several things that we can do with the metal. Much like clay, we can squish it, make it bigger, stretch it, make it thinner. We can point it, we can make it sharp. We can take the corners off it, we can make it square and round and back to square. This hammer I'm using today is a design off a farrier's hammer, but much bigger. It's called a circle round hammer. One face of the hammer is flat and the other side is like a crushed ball. It's not round. When I hit steel with the crushed ball end of it, it displaces the metal faster. Our anvil has several parts. The front of the anvil is the horn. That allows us to bend objects around it, shape them around it. It also gives us a really small surface area. If we hit an object here, it'll have a lot more pressure and move the steel a lot easier. If we hit it here on the face, it's just going to flatten it. We have a step here. This is a little bit softer than the face, and this would be an area that we'd use for chiseling so we don't damage our anvil. And on the back of the anvil, we have 2 holes. Square hole is called a hardy hole. And what it does is it allows us to put tools in it that we make. So that we can cut metal or move metal to make hooks. We have one more hole in our anvil here, and it's called a pritchel hole. It's a small round hole. Again, it's for holding tools for us, so that we can do things like chisel, whether decorative. Like I said, the fire will get hot enough to burn up the metal, and I can tell that's happening right now because of the sparks in my fire. If I take this piece of metal out right now, a firecracker. Now, sometimes we want to get our metal to this temperature. It needs to be that hot in order for us to forge weld. So if I want to stick this piece of metal to another piece of metal, we would get it up to that temperature where it's very plastic, and then we would hammer them together. Some of the other equipment that we use in here, we have pedal grinders, hand turn grinders. When a piece of metal is hot, it's not only is it easy to move, it's easy to reshape, it's easy to file, it's easy to grind. One of the things we use often, especially for completing projects, is beeswax. It's a readily available product. It allows us to lubricate and rust-proof items that we make. So a simple rat's tail curl. It serves a few purposes other than just being decorative. It's a good way to terminate a piece of metal and keeping it from being sharp. Hooks were used quite a lot, as you can imagine, for everything from hanging up, ropes or horse tack in the barn, or your shirt in the house. You need a hook for something. This one here, I'm isolating that curl I did on it so that I can hammer on it and not damage it. And that allows us to not worry about wrecking that nice work we did. We need to be careful how much air we add to. The more air we add, the hotter it gets. That can lead to burning up our pieces. Spike hook or J hook, drive hook. When we don't have to make a screw or a nail, we would incorporate it in, and that we just get hammered into your barn or in your house or in your tree or anywhere you needed a hook. They're quick and simple to make. There's a number of twists that we can do. This here is a simple decorative twist. So we'll put it in our vise, and we can twist the metal just like candy. I don't think we have much of a twist over the back end here. Because if we were to hammer directly on our anvil and onto the work we just did, we would knock all that nice twist out of it. So if we switch to a stump instead of a steel anvil, we can straighten our work. So we would use that for decorative fencing, gates, and that kind of thing.
My name is Ron, and I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about the Jake de Vries Natural Heritage Collection. Jake de Vries was a self-taught taxidermist. He took a correspondence course. He did that back in the late 50s, early 1960s. I volunteered for the Prince Edward County Stewardship, and the stewardship played a big role in bringing this collection to Ameliasburgh. When we were getting this collection ready to move, we had people from the ROM come and take a look at it, and they told us it was the biggest private collection they'd ever seen in Ontario. So we're going to start out here talking about this black bear. The black bear come from, I believe, North Bay, Ontario. He was a nuisance bear that was coming into town at night and getting into people's garages and garbage and barbecues. So the Ministry of Natural Resources decided that they were going to catch him, tranquilize him, and move him out farther out in the country where he wouldn't be a nuisance. They were able to catch him quite quickly, and that's how the black bear came into the collection. There's 2 or 3 things in this case that we should talk about. One is we have an albino beaver and an albino muskrat. We're not sure where they came from, but Jake knew that they were special. Of course, to the native people, they represent a spirit animal, so he mounted them for an educational tour. The bald eagle here, the immature bald eagle, he was put down by the Ministry of Natural Resources, and if you take a real close look at him, you'll see that he has a very crooked beak. He couldn't eat. The cause of that crooked beak was when the farmers used to spray with DDT, and DDT, of course, was very bad for birds. We'll just move just a little bit here, and you'll see in the corner, way up here, there's a hummingbird. I work for the municipality here, and twice I saw hummingbirds fly into the side of a car ahead of me, and I would stop and pick them up, and I would take them out to Jake's place. Whether that's one of them or not, I don't know. They do die incidentally sometimes. All of the songbirds come from the south shore of Prince Edward County. Part of the Ministry of Natural Resources' job was to check on lighthouses. They knew that the birds would fly into the lighthouses at night, and so they would take Jake with them, and he would pick up songbirds, do his magic with them, and bring them back to life. We're not sure where the hawks and the kestrels come from. We knew that Jake got a lot of stuff that had been poached, and the Ministry of Natural Resources used the birds and the animals for court cases. And when they were done with them, they would quite often offer them to Jake. I want to talk to you about the eel for a minute. There was a class come in, and I was standing over on the other side of the room here, and a little girl came and grabbed me by the hand, brought me over here, and she wanted to know what that was. And I said, it's an eel. And she says, where do you think they got it? And I said, well, I don't know. I said, pretty big. I said, probably from Lake Ontario. And she says, is it electric? And I said, no, I don't think so. But anyway, she was really fascinated with it. And to see her eyes light up, you know, to ask questions and stuff. I've heard Janice say that when the kids come in, how the expressions on their face and their eyes would light up. And it was really something, and it was something for me to witness that with this little girl that was 5 or 6 years old. So we'll move on over here. There's a pair of baby fawns here. The story with the baby fawns was its mother got hit on County Road 1, just south of here. And the policeman asked Jake if he wanted any of the meat from the deer. And he said, well, yeah, he would take some. So anyway, when they were preparing the deer to be butchered, they discovered that she had 2 fawns in her. They probably would have been born in the next day or 2, but rather than to just discard them, Jake decided that he was going to mount them to use them for a teaching tool again. And the baby moose is the same way. He comes from a little bit farther north. His mother was hit on the road, and again, the game wardens asked Jake if he might want the baby moose, and he was more than willing to take it. And surprisingly, the moose here, he is the most heavy mount of the whole works, and that's just because of his horns. Probably weighs 30 or 40, maybe even 50 pounds. Next, we're going to look at some exotic birds that Jake got. We don't know where the birds came from. We know that somebody raised them for exotic pets to sell to pet stores, but he has quite a big collection of exotic birds as well that come from this person. I mean, this natural collection has been a real big draw here for the county. I mean, you get people that want to paint birds and animals, that they can come and see them. People come in and they want to paint a certain bird or a certain animal, and they can see it up close and they can sit, you know. So it's been a real draw. It was a really nice gesture of the Vries family. The two kids, Jane and John, make sure the collection stayed together and that it stayed in their home of Ameliasburgh. So now we're in Ameliasburgh Heritage Village honey house. And bees played a big role in the county here, and they still do, actually. This here is a frame that goes down inside the hive. The bees draw the wax out, they fill the wax with honey, and then they cap it. And it's sold as capped honey in the comb. And it was always pretty popular when I had bees, and you still see it around quite a bit. Bees today are struggling because of, well, insecticides, mites, and climate change are all affecting bees. There was a really bad winter kill last winter, and they're saying that close to 90% of the bees in the county winter killed last winter. So I haven't seen a honeybee around our farm all summer, and usually there would be all kinds of them. Honey was used as a sweetener, just like maple syrup was, but honey was used just as much. During the war years, when sugar was rationed, honey and maple syrup became both really important for sweetener for farm families. This here is a honey extractor, and it is used to just take the honey out of the comb so you have raw honey. Honey comes out as a liquid, and then if it sits for some time, it will become white solid honey. And to get it back to a liquid form, you just put it in a pail of hot water and let it sit for a few hours, and it will go right back to a liquid. The bees reproduce in May and June. When the honey flow is heavy, the hives will become crowded and there'll be lots of honey in the hive. The queen will lay an egg, and the worker bees will feed that egg royal jelly, and they will hatch out a new queen. And then the old queen will take half the hive, and she will go and look for a new spot to set up a hive. The longer the year goes, the less likely the bees are to survive, because they don't have time enough to put away a food supply for winter. They actually need close to 200 pounds of honey to get them through the winter. The only time a bee can have a bowel movement is when it's flying, so they have to fly every day. Even in the wintertime, they will get out and fly just enough that they can have a bowel movement, and then they'll go back in the hive where it's warm. And even the queen has to do that. This here is a bee smoker. Some farmers will put binder twine in here and set it on fire. Some farmers will use just green grass and set it on fire. And they smoke the bees. As soon as you smoke a bee, it thinks its hive is on fire, and it gorges itself with honey. That makes them very docile. And that's all that's used for, to make the bees docile so they don't sting you when you're in there working with them. These are uncapping knives. Before you can extract honey, you have to cut the caps off the honey. This one is just a straight knife that is not hot. When you were done with it, you might dip it into hot water. So this is a steam uncapper, so it would stay hot. And as you would uncap the caps off the frames, you would put them onto a frame like this that's probably into a hot water bath, and that melts the wax. And actually the wax is worth way more than what the honey is. Wax is very prized, so they don't waste anything. Everything is used, let's put it that way. Okay, I'd like to welcome you to the Grimm Sugar House. The reason we call it the Grimm Sugar House is that the last owners of the Grimm Manufacturing Company, Odie and Una Grimm, retired to Ameliasburgh Township, and this is where they spent their retirement years. Now, as far as maple syrup goes, there's three things we want you to know about maple syrup. It's recognized as Canada's oldest agricultural crop. The maple seed is the longest producing seed on the farm. We start to collect sap from the tree when it's about 40 years old, and we will do that for the next 200 years. Maple has a pretty deep history. Of course, the native people were the first people to make maple sugar, and that's why they're called sugar houses, because they couldn't store syrup, but they could store sugar. And I brought with me a birch bark basket. That's what the native ladies would have stored their syrup in. And they usually made about 120 pounds of sugar for each member of their family every year. So they had a pretty sweet tooth. Today we use about 140 pounds of sweetener per person per year. This is a Grimm evaporator. It was made in Montreal, Quebec. The Grimm company was started in the Hudson Valley in Ohio. They started making evaporators for the sorghum industry. The maple people got interested in them very quickly, so they closed their plant in Ohio and they moved to Rutland, Vermont. They set up a plant there that did very well. And two of the boys moved to Montreal and started the Grimm Manufacturing Company in Montreal. And that was around 1890 or so that happened. As a young man, Odie Grimm wanted to take over the business from his dad and his uncle. They weren't ready to retire, so he borrowed $10,000 from his dad, moved from Montreal to Toronto, and he started the Dad's Cookie Company. There's some of the Dad's cookies. And he ran it up until about 1947, and he sold the cookie company and moved back to Montreal and took over the evaporator business. Maple syrup is the big seller today. We do have byproducts. We sell all kinds of stuff: stirred sugar, maple candy, maple butter, and of course maple syrup. There's more than one kind of maple tree. The two common types that we make syrup from in this area is the sugar maple and the black maple. And I brought a sample of the leaves here. You can always tell a black maple if you turn the leaf over and look at the stem and the veins that run through the leaves. They have hairs on them. The sugar maple is bald. Maple sugar was made in big blocks, and cane sugar came in a big, like, ice cream cone. It was about 20 inches across the bottom and about 22 or 23 inches high. The log cabin lady, every morning she would have had to have ground her own granulated sugar because there was no granulated sugar. It all came in blocks. And this is called the sugar devil, and its sole purpose is for taking blocks of sugar, and she would make it into granulated sugar that she would use for porridge and that she would use to cook with through the day. Now, she wouldn't waste her time making granulated sugar for tea or coffee. She would cut sugar cubes, and these are called sugar nippers, and all they're for is cutting sugar cubes. Now, I have come across this sugar devil, and the thing that's unique about this one, it's got a patent date on it. It's November of 1919. These were just going out of service. The sugar companies were starting to make granulated sugar instead of blocks of sugar. So he patented it just as they were coming out of service. Syrup today, there's a lot of regulations with it. Part of the regulations in the labeling is that we have to have the words maple syrup or pure maple syrup. They should be in French and English. They have to have the producer's name and his contact information. We have to have the grade of syrup. We have to have the volume of syrup. This here is stirred sugar. We make it with a machine. It's really popular. You heat the syrup up 50 degrees above the boiling point of water, and then you start to whip it right away. And after you whip it for about 20 minutes or so, it starts to form sugar. And the maple butter is just one step above syrup. It's really popular. Oh, I brought a bucket. There's a lot of neat little stories in the maple business. This here's called a sweetheart bucket. And the story with this bucket is there was a young family that lived just outside of Ottawa, and the boy married a girl from the city. And in the springtime, she was eager to help out on the farm, and she couldn't remember which bucket she had gathered and which bucket she hadn't. So this young lad, he painted a heart on the side of the bucket, and when she would pick it off the tree and dump it, she would turn the bucket around and hang it back on the tree. And that way she would know if she'd been to the tree or not. They sell for $60 or $70 a piece now. I traded some equipment to get that one. A can of syrup like this would be the old gallon can. A can of syrup like this would make 8 pounds of sugar. The syrup weighed 12 pounds, and the sugar weighs 8 pounds when you're done. This was the first time that they could store syrup really successfully for long periods of time. Maple syrup boils at 7 degrees above the boiling point of water. So in the morning, the sugar maker would take his thermometer, he would boil it in water, and then he would just add 7 degrees to that to get maple syrup. We have a couple pairs of snowshoes. The snowshoes are not very big, so they would have been a child's set of snowshoes or maybe a woman's set of snowshoes. The young boys would help gather wood. They would help gather sap. The young girls would work with their mother at making the syrup and making the sugar. So Like I say, up until 1860, all the syrup was made into sugar, and then if they wanted syrup through the year, they would just add hot water to it. So this here is a Grimm Champion evaporator. The cold sap would come in through this float system here. The firebox is 3 feet long in this machine. So the cold sap comes in here, goes down this side of the evaporator, crosses over and comes back up through the center partition. It crosses over and goes back through the outside, and as it goes down, the sap gets thicker and thicker and thicker. It goes through the siphon here, and it would go through this siphon, and it would cross over and come around here, and you would draw your syrup off from this corner of the evaporator. Now this machine will make about 1.5 gallons to 2 gallons of syrup an hour if you have really sweet sap and you're burning really good wood. Okay, what we have here is a few spiles that go into the tree. Like you would actually drill a hole in the tree and you would drive your spile in so it's tight and it won't leak, and that's how you collect the sap out of the tree. The early pioneers used wooden spile, and they were hard to keep clean, and then they went to a rather crude type of spile that was used for a number of years. And then finally they started going to cast iron spiles like this one. And then they went to spiles like this with the tubing systems. Now in 1998, when the ice storm hit eastern Ontario and western Quebec, the standard drill size hole to go into a tree was 7/16 of an inch. That year the evaporator companies and the provincial government decided that they were going to make a smaller spile, 5/16, to help the trees heal quicker, and they thought it would take less sap out of the tree. To their surprise, the 5/16 spile collected more sap than the 7/16 spile. But the 5/16 has become the standard, and that's what's used today throughout the maple industry. Now I should just mention a couple dates. 1860 marked the historical peak in production in Canada. And surprisingly, 1960 marked the historical low point in production. For a lot of people, it looked like the maple industry was going to collapse and fold. And once they solved the problems of the tubing systems, people immediately became interested in it. And production has grown ever since, and it's still growing today. I think in closing, we have to get the message out that the best use of the maple tree is maple syrup production.
Hi, I'm Joanne. Welcome to the log cabin. Here in Ameliasburgh, we've got the log cabin, and it's set up as it would have been for about 1905. The log cabins were really built as an interim home for the family to grow in till they could get something else nicer. In the fall, we would be bringing in whatever crops we had grown, and the lady of the house would have been teaching her daughters how to take the food that she'd brought in and set it up ready for the fall and the winter so that they had food still when they came to the spring. So we would have carrots, and we'd have beans, and all the sort of other things that we would have had out in the fields. They would be put down. The meats would have been salted. We did have metal canning at that point, but we also had jar canning, which some of you may have even seen your grandmothers and grandfathers doing. According to this list that I have in front of me, you'd need 1 to 2 bushels of beets, 2 to 3 bushels of carrots, about 30 head of cabbage, 10 to 20 stalks of celery, a bushel of turnips, 6 to 14 bushels of potatoes, depending on how much you guys liked potatoes, a couple of bushels of sweet potatoes, squashes and pumpkins, 30 to 40 of them, onions, 1 to 2 bushels, parsnips, 1 or 2 bushels, leeks, 15 to 40, and garlic, well, as much as you could, but at least about 8 pounds. All of that would be brought in and prepared by the mother of the family to get the family through the winter. By the spring, your carrots that looked like this in the fall would have been rubbery and black, but they would have still been consumed because it would have been all you had. Your onions, a lot of the time, they would have started to get moldy. A lot of your herbs would have now been dried because they would have been brought in, and as you can see behind me, we have some things hung behind me here on the wall. Those herbs would have been brought in fresh in the fall, and they would then be put away to get you through the winter. We have bread, which Mom would have baked once a week. That would have been wrapped and put aside. And all of this stuff would have been put down in various ways. So carrots, for instance, would go in a barrel, and then they would be covered with sand. and then another layer of carrots and another layer of sand. And that barrel would be kept in a cold cellar or a root cellar. Eventually, some of those vegetables and meats would be put into a pot, and the pot, once these were chopped, would go on the stove, and a pot of soup would be made. And a pot of perpetual soup would be set on the back of the stove, and when you came in from working the fields, there was something there for you to eat. One of the chores that the children would have had would have been to churn the butter. Usually the girls would be sent out to milk the cows. When the milk came in, the cream would eventually rise to the top. That would be skimmed off. The milk that was skimmed would then be put into some form of butter churn. In this case, we have a wooden butter churn. And the smaller children, I've actually had children as young as 3 or 4 that can actually do this, who will sit. They could sit on a chair, stand beside it, and they would actually churn the butter for the family. And if they had enough butter left over, they'd make enough for their family, they could actually wrap it and take it into whatever dry goods store was in the area. And that butter would then be traded in at the store for either coin or other goods that they needed for the home. Some of the milk was used to make cheese, and the family would make their own cheeses as well. Now they would have had either a wood stove or an open hearth for cooking. At this time of year, they quite often had a summer kitchen. You're annoying me. Let's see if we can get this to light. There's no such thing as electricity in the cabin. And at the time that the cabin was originally built, the likelihood of having electricity is very slim, as it was built early in the mid 1800s. So candles, lamps, oil lamps, would have been used for lighting after dark. You wouldn't light them usually during the day, simply because you wouldn't want to waste the fuel. So quite often you would work quite close to a window or a door. In the summer, the family would have what they would call a summer kitchen. They would either build a fireplace outside, they might have a roof over it. It probably wouldn't have walls. If it did have walls, it would have very large open windows with shutters on it. And if they didn't have an open hearth, what they would use is actually the wood stove. And what they would do is, while it was not lit obviously, they would disassemble it, take it out the door, and put it where the summer kitchen was going to be. And they would use that through the summer and into the fall for all their canning and processing, so that all the food would keep through the winter. Plus it would keep the cabin cooler while it was really warm and hot. And then when the fall came, the summer kitchen would then be loaded with the wood for the winter, so that it was close to the house, easy to reach, and you could bring it in. So when the children were sent for wood, they didn't have to go too far if there was a blizzard blowing. Now, what I would normally ask children is how I make this ironwork. I've had children tell me that you would put it in a bucket of hot water. No, because then your clothes would get wet. I've had them say, stick it in the fire. Well, that would be good, but it would get black. And then my white shirt would get all black. And then I actually tell them that what I would actually do with it, and if I was very lucky, I'd have 2. I would set it on the stove where it would heat, and eventually, when it was hot enough, I would put a cloth over it and lift it, and I would bring it over probably to this table, which would have a blanket on it and whatever I was ironing, and I would then do my ironing with my cast iron, which I obviously would not put my hand under. It would hurt. One of the things that the family would have done, they would have had a small building that they would keep wood ash, hardwood ash in. Hardwood ash was leached, so in the corner there was a bucket. It's an old oaken bucket, and what they would do is they would put the wood ash into that. They would pour water over it, and it would actually sit in a pot like this old pot here. Eventually what would happen is the water leaches down through the ash and it removes the lye that's in the hardwood. Eventually they have enough of it that they would boil it up and they would cook it and add other ingredients like lard to it, and they would make soap. And eventually they end up with some soap that looks like this, which is very mushy. And eventually they figured out how to make it so it was a little bit harder. And then when they went to do their dishes, when they went to do their laundry, when they went to have a bath, it was also what they used to wash their hands, wash their face, and wash their hair. The soap was used for all things. No fancy soaps. This is a washboard, and this would have been sat in your wash tub with your soap, and you would scrub your clothes on the washboard, and when you were finished and you washed them, then you would rinse them and hang them. When that was all done, you would hang it outside. If you had lines to hang it on, you would hang it on the clotheslines. If you didn't have lines, you'd hang it over the bushes. Once it was all dry, you would bring it back in, and that's when you would get your iron out and put it on the stove to get started on your ironing. So a lot of your dry goods would have been kept in a cabinet. If you had jars, so if you bought something in the shops, you would make sure it was kept properly because you didn't want to lose anything. So your sugars, your flours, all that sort of thing would have been kept in cans and jars. Often jars of this type at that time with a rubber ring on it to keep things fresh. A lot of the spices that were quite common here to us now were very rare through the 1800s because it cost so much to transport them. In 1900, cinnamon would have been kept under lock and key. It would have been considered that expensive. Something that you might bring out when you had company, or maybe if you had a little better, you might have done it on a Sunday, you might have had something. But it wasn't an everyday occurrence, not unless you had quite a lot of money. Some sugar was kept loose that you'd grind, but usually sugar was ground in the mornings, and it would come in cones. Now, this isn't actual, but it would come in a sugar cone, and each day you would take what you needed. So if you were doing baking one day, you might grind more sugar. On those days when you were only maybe having a bit in your tea, you'd use a little bit of sugar. And quite often people would get one of these and they would keep it simply as a status symbol because it indicated that you could actually afford to have sugar. We're standing in a log cabin. Logs would have been brought down as the lot that the family had was cleared. They would have been cut to lengths, edged so that the one edge is flat. So if you just look into that corner, you can see sort of where they're notched together. So they sort of lock together thus. Once the logs are up and everything is completed, they put the chinking in between to knock out the drafts and stop the critters getting in. If Dad was really good with a penknife, he might have actually whittled you a doll's head and a little body. And then that little doll's head and body would go into Mom, and she'd tell you how to go about making that doll into a doll, so you'd learn to make the rest of the body. These little fellas in here, these are China dolls, and they would have been very expensive, and if you were living in a cabin, you probably wouldn't have been able to afford to have one. However, Dad could probably find a piece of wood and make you a doll. You could make a wooden-headed doll, or you could make what we call the church doll. And you've probably also seen the corn husk dolls. Now, people say, well, why would you have a church doll? I'm going to tell you. If I have a wooden-headed doll, and I go to church, because I'm probably going to go to church every Sunday because Mom and Dad's going to make me, and I'm playing with my doll, and I drop her, I'm in big trouble. Because the fella at the top up there who's talking about all the terrible sins that I have, he just got mad at me. And Mom and Dad, they're mad at me too. But if I take my church doll and I drop her, she doesn't make as much noise, so I don't get into trouble. So quite often you would have a little church doll that you would get, and you'd learn to make clothes for her. So she's got a little crocheted piece. You might have a little china set with a cup. Children today quite often get plastic kitchen sets. Well, in this case, we have a little pot and a little pan on a cast iron stove. We have china cups and saucers and tea toys, because toys weren't easy to come by, so you had to improvise. Corn husks were available. You could make a doll. You could still make a doll.
Welcome to our gray planting barn. We have housed lots of implements in here from the olden days of farms. One fun thing to see is our old sprayer. Prince Edward County is known for its apple industry, and back in the day, they still needed to spray their apples against the rust and various insects that would have plagued the area. So this is an old apple sprayer that we are proud to have. This large McDonald threshing machine from Stratford, Ontario, is one of the largest implements that we have here to show. Back in the day, this was used by a co-op of farmers. By using this machine, you could take and thresh the grain from the chaff, and the straw would go out one way, and you could have the straw lining up in a row so that you could put it in stooks in the field for your animal livestock care. And then the grain would be shot off into another bin on the other side so that you could take that and dry it and put it in your grain bin, your granary in your farm. This is a little interesting implement that we have. It's a horse treadmill, and this would have been used on a ferry going from the mainland to an island. What you would have to do back in the horse and buggy day is arrive at the station for the ferry. You would have to unhook your horse from the carriage or the buggy. You would have to lead your horse up through here into the treadmill, brace it in place, and as the horse trod along, it would have the paddle running the ferry. You would have 3 of these side by side, and the horse-powered treadmill would be the horsepower that you had to use to get from, let's say, Rossmore over to Belleville. This large implement wagon here is a stump puller. And if you ever drive through Prince Edward County and you see a lot of farm fields that look basically clear and flat, and all of a sudden you come across one large standing tree in the middle of the field, it's because they would have to use this stump puller with several oxen, and you would have to wrap the rope around the tree and use that power of physics to get the stump to release from the earth or even a large stone. So this was something that was really handy to have, and it was, again, something that only a few farmers would have been having the access to. But back in the olden days, when they needed as much farmland as they could to make a profit for their farm, this stump puller was something to be had.
Hello, I'm Linda Summer. I am the president of the Quinte Educational Museum and Archives. We are located right now in the Victoria Schoolhouse, which is adjacent to the Ameliasburgh Heritage Village. Our schoolhouse was built in 1904 and was located on the Vries and Gore side roads. Before you enter the schoolhouse, you will see outside a bell in a cairn. And quite often one-room schoolhouses had a tower where that bell would have been stored. This schoolhouse did not have a tower, and the large bell would always be used to warn students who are walking to school that school is going to start very soon and they need to move along. On the other side as well, to the left, is the woodshed. It is the original woodshed from 1904, and each family would contribute wood that could be used in the wood stove during the course of the winter. Behind me outside are the outhouses, and of course you have to have outhouses for students. These outhouses are quite unique because they do not have a pit underneath them. They have drawers. And so these drawers would have to be pulled out weekly and taken to the farmer's field, dumped, cleaned, and put back. We couldn't have a well here either. So students, every day, someone would be chosen to go to the neighboring farm with a pail and bring the water back to the water jug that's at the back of the classroom. And there are 2 metal cups there, and one for boys and one for girls. Inside here, there are a variety of desks, from very, very small ones that would have been used early in the 1900s to the later ones that were used into the 1950s. And this schoolhouse was used until 1967, when Quinte School was built in the village of Ameliasburgh. This would have had grades 1 to 8. So in the blackboard behind me, you can see a wide variety of work from the primary grade 1s right through to grade 8. And this would just be a bit of the work that would have been done in this school. The teacher is responsible for everything that happens in this school. And she needed to have absolute silence in here so that she could teach all 8 grades, not at the same time, but she would get one grade started and then she would move to another grade. And so you would have to be able to work very, very quietly. Discipline was very important here. Talking was not allowed. And so we have instances where dots were put on the board and a student would have to stand there with their nose on the dot to be quiet. We have also a wooden block. If a student is very, very fidgety, they would stand on the block, arms down, and sit very still. Correct answers were the only answers that were accepted. The teachers really didn't care what you thought about something. They wanted the correct answer. And sometimes if you did not give the correct answer, you would be considered a dunce. And so there is a stool at the front with a black dump cap on it, and you could sit at the front of the classroom with the cap on until the teacher determined that you had spent enough time thinking about your mistake or until you came up with the correct answer. The other way of disciplining here in this classroom was the strap. And as the teacher here, I determined what happened and when it happened. There's no secretary, there is no principal, I don't have to call anybody. And in 1904, I wouldn't even have had a phone, so I would not be able to even talk to your parents about your behavior. So we have 2 kinds of straps. The first one is rather wobbly. I know it's very stringy, but it's wobbly. And it probably would have been used for grade 1s, very, very light. The other one though is very, very thick. And this would have been used on the older students. And students have to remember that when something like this happened, it wasn't a good thing for their family because their family is paying my salary, like I said, and they've paid for the schoolhouse. So they're not going to be really happy that you've gotten the strap, and you would probably get in trouble at home as well. The other thing is that I am married. And as a married teacher, I would not be allowed to teach here. As soon as there were any thoughts of my getting married, then I would have to leave my job. Men who taught usually were from the military. They were retired Army people, and they were allowed to come and teach. The school day would start about 9 o'clock, and it would probably run till 3:30 or 4. You would eat lunch here as well, so students would bring their lunch. Because the wood stove was here, and if the wood stove was running during the winter time, students could be asked to bring some vegetables, and they would make soup or a stew here that they would all share at lunchtime. We do have a piano, and in the 1940s, there was an itinerant music teacher. So that meant that she traveled from each schoolhouse to provide music classes for students. Every subject was taught: history, geography, math, English, and everybody, whether you wanted to or not, were right-handed. And as the teacher, I had the right to tie your hand behind your back, make you sit on your hand, and to force you to use your right hand, because left-handedness was not considered a proper thing. So once a teacher had assessed that you were writing correctly, you would be allowed to use pen and ink. And so the students, many of the desks have holes in them, which is where your inkwell would have sat, and the teacher would provide the ink, and you would have used a feather such as this with the end sharpened and use that for your writing. You had to remember that ink was very expensive, it was hard to get, so it was not until you were perfect that you would be allowed to use this.
Prince Edward County has so much history, and included in that is about the canning industry that was started here, right in Prince Edward County. Back in 1882, Wellington Bolter, who was a Demorestville farmer, and a friend of his discovered that the canning industry was something that we could perform here and do well at it here in Prince Edward County. They went down to the World's Fair in Philadelphia in 1882, came back with a wealth of knowledge on how to create crops that did well in our climate, learning how to use the proper canning facilities, the proper canning and handling of the produce. The labels back in 1882 were vibrant colors and awesome photos because illiteracy was still rampant in the area. So we needed a good marketing ploy. You had a wonderful picture of the product that was contained within the can. It was more than likely that the lady of the house would get that product off your shelf. We grew everything from corn to peas to tomatoes to pumpkins. You can see a lot of the old implements that were used in canning. Back in the heyday of Prince Edward County canning industry, there were 77 canning factories operating all at one time. This map here exemplifies where each of the canning factories were located and what years they lasted until. The last canning industry here is the Sprague Institute of Mountain View, and they were here until 1996. Their property didn't allow them enough space to accommodate renovating and expanding, so they moved into Belleville, Ontario. So the Sprague Company is the last of the canning factories here in Prince Edward County. But back in the early 50s and 60s, we were known as the Garden County of Canada. This beautiful exhibit wouldn't have been possible without the generous donation of the Crawford family. Doug Crawford did a lot of the handwork of collecting a lot of these artifacts. And with his wife Ruth and their daughter Catherine, they generous have kept us in their toes because we have lots to show here with the Doug Crawford Canning Collection.